project that actually we did 2 or 3 years ago, and that specifically looked at actually the metrics behind how you go about feeding a city, how big's that as an issue, what makes a difference, that sort of stuff. So some numbers around cities was something we did, so I'll talk about that. Then we're going to talk a bit about some of our experience through various projects that we've been involved with around how you get people to act on that sort of information. So we'll move away from Oxford for a little while and talk about some work we did in Manchester and some more broad commercial experience that we've got, because I think that motivation to act bit is really important. Then Julian's going to bring us back to the city scale a bit and talk about some international examples and what we can learn from those, and then we'll bring those learnings back to Oxford again. So we'll start with Oxford and finish with Oxford and do a bit of a tour in the middle. So if that makes sense, that's how it's going to work. Okay. So FoodPrinting Oxford is the main bit of work that I've been involved with around Oxford's food system. It was a piece of work that was commissioned by Low Carbon Oxford, which I think doesn't exist anymore, does it?
It does exist, but it's being transferred over to a new
wrapper,
yeah.
Right? So it's, anyway, but it's part of the council essentially. So this was a report on how you feed Oxford, based on some work that I've been involved in previously. So I'll talk a little bit about that previous work and then how that got translated into FoodPrinting Oxford. But essentially, what's of interest is that we were commissioned by what amounts to the city council to look at Oxford's food sustainability and what they can do to increase its reliability and sustainability. Okay, but prior to that piece of work, and what that piece of work was based on was something called How to Feed a City, a project that we developed through an organisation that was called Landshare. It's one that I set up, which has kind of morphed into through Keel now. Landshare was a community interest company. Keel's a private consultancy, and basically the project, the How to Feed a City project, was it was a reaction to the fact that we were very much involved in food sustainability, but we were aware that there are a lot of assumptions out there about what makes food sustainable, and I guess there was a certain sense of frustration amongst some of our advisors and some of the people we were collaborating with around, well, actually, what really counts, what really matters, what are the numbers behind these things. And we were quite interested in saying, well, okay, how do you go about feeding the kind of populations that we have to deal with if we're thinking about food systems? And those are predominantly urban populations globally. We sort of just wanted to answer some very basic questions, and it was inspired a little bit by some work around publication I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, that David McKay from Cambridge, I think it is, wrote on sustainable energy without the hot air. The thing in there was he said he wanted numbers, not adjectives, and that's what we wanted for the food system. We kind of wanted to cut to the chase of not the stories around what's sustainable, but actually what really counts. So we're asking simple questions like, well, how much food does a city consume then? How much do you have to produce? What impact does it have? And so how big's the issue? How big's this thing we need to solve? Is there a thing we need to solve? What difference do things like the things that we assume, the kind of received wisdom about what's sustainable, things like organic, local, meat-free, less packaging, how much difference do they make? Which of those should we be choosing before we start to push policy or try and persuade people to act? And then there's this whole thing that was particularly interesting at the time for people around, and interestingly, become interesting, has risen up again through city region food systems, which is a bit of an area of interest at the moment. Around what would it mean practically for a city to feed itself? Actually, how much land? How could we do it? And is it a good idea? But actually, can we measure that food footprint, that food shed? So those are the sorts of questions we were going to ask. We wanted to ask, and I rashly said, "Well, that's fine. Just raise a bit of cash and we'll answer it." But so what we did was we commissioned some work through a local consultancy, and we basically looked at two things. One was an impacts analysis tool which we created, and the other one was to do with an analysis of food sheds, which is the production areas around cities, and to look at their potential to produce food for the city and the mismatch potentially between what the city requires. and what could be produced in and around the city. So the impacts analysis bit was essentially an analysis tool based not on our primary research, but on the most up-to-date published data that's out there. We used life cycle analysis data, basically whole food chain analysis data, looking at various input variables, which we then crunched through a rather very effective but difficult to create analysis tool, which gave us out a set of outputs or food footprints or food prints. The input variables were the things that we reckoned had the most impact on food systems, and what we were trying to do with this was create something which enabled us to test scenarios and to see what kind of combinations of factors made a difference in to these food footprints, these impacts of the food system. So we're looking at input variables like diet, provenance, production system, waste, energy, where does the energy come from, packaging, those sorts of factors. And the outputs, the food footprints, the impacts, we were quite careful about what we chose. At the time, people were very much just looking at greenhouse gas emissions. And we felt that, one, if you just look at one indicator, you get perverse outcomes. And two, actually, we were already at this stage very aware that we were wanting people to be motivated to make a change. And actually we knew that things like land, water, energy in particular they have quite a lot of resonance as being risk factors for people who are commercially active within supply chains. And so it's quite useful to indicate these as impacts, which are actually also of commercial interest. These are commercial sensitivities within the supply chain. And so we're quite strategic about the fact that we wanted multi-metrics, and we wanted metrics which people would be bothered about for more reasons than the goodness of their heart, essentially. So that was kind of what we created, and it's a scenarios tool, and it's also a risk analysis tool, essentially. The second part of what we were looking at, and this presents in very broad terms what came out for Oxford, I'll go into a bit more detail on that in a bit, was looking at the foodshed analysis, was essentially looking at the land in and around a city and saying, well, how much land do you require to feed that city in different food groups, and how does that match up against the types of production that's happening around the city? So we're just doing a gap analysis essentially between this is how much land you require to feed the city, this is how that land requirement breaks down into different food production systems and the area that those require, and this is how much of those food production systems, like cereals, dairy, fruit and veg, meat production, you've got around that city. And that was part of this testing thing of does that make sense? Yeah. And this is predicated obviously on the idea that, of course, well, it's not an assumption, but it's based around food being produced around that city. Of course, it's not produced around that city, but a lot of people talk about local production, so we kind of wanted to test this sort of hinterland production thing. So those are the two dimensions we looked at, and what we did was we, not just for fun, but for the purposes of communication, we put it into a kind of wrapper, which was a food print calculator. So that's a kind of online tool that people could use for themselves, essentially, and basically play with the input variables, play with the balance of diet, play with where things come from, play with amount of food waste, play with those variables basically, and it would give you food print results for a given population, and then a whole load of other analyses came out of it as well. And the idea is that we felt that actually effective communication often comes not so much from telling people what to do to be most sustainable, but giving people the tools to test their own hypotheses around what might be sustainable for them, or what might work for them, for their circumstances, whether they're a business, an individual, a family, a retailer, or a city authority. So that was kind of the idea behind creating that. So we did all that, and that got the City Council in Oxford sufficiently interested that they commissioned some work around. Well, okay, how does that look if you apply it to Oxford? So they commissioned this this FoodPrinting Oxford report, and so I'll just share some, in very broad terms, some of the 10 minutes. I'm doing all right, Julian, I think.
I was trying to tell you when
you do, yes. So what I'll do is I'll just go through some of what we found through applying that tool, that approach to Oxford. So what do people eat in Oxford? Well, there are 150,000 people in Oxford. They eat about I think about 150,000 tonnes of food a year, and it kind of breaks down like that. And the implication of that in terms of those food footprints is all, by the way, in this FoodPrinting Oxford report, which you can download from the Landshare website, but also you can get it from your website and the Good Food Oxford website. And so just in very broad terms, what are the impacts, or what are the impacts of Oxford's food system? Well, it's more greenhouse gases than all the cars. I can give you the figures. It's 70 million pounds worth of energy is embodied within Oxford's food footprint. It's about 500 square kilometres worth of land, which is about 15 kilometre diameter, I think, something around about that radius going out from Oxford. So in broad terms, it's quite big. It's quite useful to be able to communicate those things, policy terms. It's quite useful. Yes, sorry.
Can I just ask, is that more than all of the cars in Oxford?
Yeah, all of the cars, specifically the emissions from using the cars, not the whole, not the production element so not manufacture. So it's usage of cars for that year is about equivalent to the emissions from food. Quite useful to be able to put a number figure on how much the energy costs, because that in itself is clearly, if you can do something about that and you're a business involved in the food system, then you can save yourself some money. The land footprint is quite interesting. The water footprint as well, we worked out. Those sorts of things, again, they represent risk factors. The other thing we looked at, any more questions on that one, by the way? I could give you the actual figures, but I sort of feel that sort of the point really is that it gives people an idea of the scale of the issue and kind of where it might hurt them, basically. So they can measure any kind of any solutions against the scale of that problem. If you're looking at a solution which addresses the key sustainability issues for Oxford, does it actually have a big impact on those figures? That's kind of the bar, basically. That sets the bar. Well, we also looked at we used our scenarios tool essentially to look at what kind of things make a difference, and there's nothing that will startle people who are involved in food sustainability around that. Essentially you can, if you fiddle with diet, reduce meat consumption, substitute it with grains and fruit and veg, then you have, that's one of the big things that has a big impact. And if you reduce food waste, that also, those are the big levers. But lots of other things do have an impact as well. But things like how local it is, it isn't having a massive impact directly on those sorts of metrics. It has other wider impacts, obviously, and has other implications. So there's a little bit of double thinking goes on there, which is quite interesting. How much difference is possible? That was quite a useful thing for us to highlight for Oxford, because actually, if you look at where Oxford is, it's sort of the same as the UK as a whole. Really, having analysed using sort of localising national statistics essentially to Oxford's circumstances, situation, and socio-economic situation, there's not really a great deal of difference. And in fact, I'm sure that our confidence limits negate that difference. But actually, if you look at scenarios which are relatively consumption scenarios that are pretty realistic, relatively realistic, things like WWF's Live Well Played plus meeting energy production targets for renewables use and doing best in class in terms of waste, in terms of food waste, then you can actually bring down the impact, the food footprints of the city by a significant proportion, sort of 30%, that sort of stuff. So theoretically, within the bounds of practical possibilities, if it should be possible to reduce the food footprint. Okay, the second element of what we looked at was the food shed, which is where the food comes from, and the big story there really is that local direct sources, they may be the great hope of lots of people, but actually local direct sources at the moment are actually significantly less than 1% of our overall consumption of food in Oxford and pretty much anywhere in the UK really. Actually, a large portion by value, this is by value, of the rest is coming from the UK, and of the rest, lots comes from the EU, and the smallest portion is actually outside the EU by value. So that's kind of our situation. The striking thing really is not so much how much comes from globally and across the world, and most of that comes in by boat. The striking thing is that within the UK, it's brought in at a national. It's all centralised, essentially, and there's only really one route to market, and aside from a potential other route to market, which isn't fully developed in terms of scale. But anyway, undaunted, if you take a look at this, how this breaks down, it's quite interesting that actually things like private gardens and allotments in the city have quite an impact, and potentially have an even greater impact. They could be up to 12.5% of fruit and veg consumption in the city could be met by that sort of private production. So whilst at the moment it's a tiny proportion, and even now actually there's a more than a tokenistic amount of particularly fruit and veg production could be produced locally, and that's partly because essentially it's land intensive, so you don't need much land to produce quite a lot of stuff, basically. An interesting kind of side story there. We also looked at what's the capacity if we wanted to change that, if we felt that there was something risky and something a bit unstable about the fact that basically all of our food is coming from centralised distribution systems, and there may be risks inherent in that which aren't being hedged. If we wanted to increase local direct sources, sources from around the hinterland around Oxford, in order perhaps to hedge the risks or to increase a sort of local food culture, what might be possible? How does our current consumption pattern get met by current production patterns around Oxford? And so we looked at that. We dived into DEFRA stats and NICS which is the agricultural source book, various things like that, used Cranfield data and dug into it and had a pretty good hash at looking at what was available. And we looked at this in terms of current demand profile and also in terms of that alternative scenario that I referred to before, just to see what would be possible in the land in Oxfordshire, producing for the population of Oxfordshire, not just Oxford. We adjusted for that. So could Oxfordshire feed itself? And actually there's a surplus in terms of arable, but in terms of feed crops, and we did a bit of a sort of division up for arable versus feed crops, because of course feed crops are predominantly arable. And there's a real deficit, essentially, for land. The land available isn't enough for current demand. Rotational grass, again, livestock-oriented stuff, there's a deficit, essentially, in Oxfordshire, so you couldn't meet it. The other big deficit is around horticulture and field veg production. The land available, the land that's being used to produce local veg and fruit is significantly, order of magnitude-wise, smaller than current demand and particularly alternative demand, because we've actually upped fruit and veg production there. So if you needed the gap analysis, if you wanted to do 100% of your food in Oxfordshire, you're going to have to change your demand profile. You're going to have to grow a lot more veg, which changing demand profile is kind of shorthand for saying eat less meat, basically, to fit it all in. So even if you wanted to do only a small proportion, you'd still particularly have to make some big changes. The other thing we looked at was who's able to make a change? Who's able to who's able to actually address all this stuff. And so, what am I doing for time? I better hurry. So basically, what we looked at here was people across the supply chain. What was most effective to do? What were the most effective actions that influenced those food footprints, and who was most able to act? But I think the problem that I'd highlight from this piece of work and this approach is that essentially it creates this kind of perfect world solution. It says, yes, you could do something about this. There's a big problem, you could do something about it. Here are the people that could do something about it. But it's kind of assuming that everyone's going to resolve to be good. We looked at that. But this is something we explored, and I'll be very brief on this because I'm cutting down to Julian's time. We looked at this through a recent project, actually, where we applied the food printing methodology, the whole methodology we applied to Oxford. We applied it to Manchester. This was commissioned by basically the local enterprise partnership. They were interested in how their food system could help reduce greenhouse gas emissions in 3 local enterprise partnership areas in the northwest. And the one I'll refer to here is Manchester. And I guess the take-home message for this talk is that we analysed things that made a difference, materiality. So stuff you could do in the food system that actually count in terms of, in this case, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but you could be the other food footprints as well. But actually also, critically, our analysis of whether it was a good policy, a good idea to bother with, was it had to count there in terms of materiality, but it had to count also in terms of someone wanting to do it. It had to have resonance. And that materiality resonance kind of matrix, I think, is absolutely critical. I mean, it looks really simple there. It is really simple, actually, a really simple concept, but it's a really good matrix for analysing, is it a good idea? Because it could be the most impactful thing in the world, but if no one wants to do it, there's no point in trying. So we did that. To cast a very long story short, we looked at that sort of stuff in Manchester. We came up with analyses for what they might do in Manchester, who might be interested in getting involved, why they might be interested in getting involved, what's in it for them. And came up with basically public procurement, information campaign proposals. The other dimension to this that I think it's quite interesting to look at is Keel does a lot of work with, we do a lot of commercial work with people in food supply chain, with people who are involved in in retail and food processing. And it's quite useful to think, well, who has power within the food system, and where are their motivations for taking action? And again, this is again getting that resonance thing to really work for us. Why might they be interested in doing some of this stuff which reduces those food footprints? And you know, it's going to be tangential to our reasons for wanting to do it. They've got hard commercial reasons, and this is just a kind of mock-up heat map of where power might exist within food supply chains. Our experience is people. I often think in terms of retailers in particular, that people are interested. The retailers are interested. Their bottom line is they want a reliable supply. They don't want an empty shelf when their competitors have full shelves, or whatever it is, tomatoes and strawberries. They don't want to poison their customers because that's really bad. They don't want their input costs to go through the roof because again they want to be competitive. And they sort of want to be seen as a trustworthy brand. There's variation between different brands around this, but they're all kind of moving towards kind of, you can kind of trust us. We're broadly decent people to work with. That's kind of, I think those are the sorts of lenses in our experience that you can kind of call them different things. You can dress up sustainability in different ways, but basically when it comes down to it, these are the things that sort of keep them awake at night. You know, your Marks and Spencers, your Tesco's, your Sainsbury's of the world. I think those are big drivers for those sorts of people. They're not the only actors in the food supply chain. There's government, there's policymakers as well. So some learnings from that are dealing with that sort of stuff. So, and we're seeing, and there's work that we're doing which sees convergence of strategic sourcing, they call it, and sustainability. So reputation. So this is some work we did for an unnamed retailer, where we were basically looking at multidimensional risk analyses and looking at reputational. Basically, they amounted to reputational risks, supply chain risks. Is it going to stop coming, and how does it affect their ongoing viability? And I guess my last take is that I think critical ingredients to this, therefore, are learnings from actually getting these foodprint aspirations to turn into action. Is that yes, you have to inform people. People have to know that what they're going to do is going to have an impact. You have to convince them that it's a good idea, but critically also to really make it move. You have to motivate them. You have to motivate them, motivated by their interests. And I think those are very often tangential to the reasons we start out, which is we want a sustainable food system. A lot of the people who have power within the system are going to be motivated elsewhere. They just have to be for practical reasons. Julian now is going to answer the question: how do you locate these learnings back into a city level, basically? How do you make those relevant at the level of a city? And does that set you up?
Yeah. So I wanted to return to the question to begin with of why cities, in particular, and the topic of the whole seminar series as well, which is looking at multiple levels of action. So we started off looking in the first week at national dietary guidelines from Sweden, then went down to looking at regional levels with Mike's talk, and capital cities last week, and this week talking about smaller cities, provincial cities. In the context of food sustainability, why are we interested in those lower levels of action? Tom's been talking very much about working with big corporate players. What role does the city have in there? Can Oxford influence the way Tesco runs its supply chain? I think there are a couple of reasons why we might be interested. One is that a lot of the recent insights into food sustainability bring us back time and time again to consumption, and that as much as we might try to influence the various ways in which supply chains work, and as much as we might try to influence agricultural production to improve the sustainability there, unless we change people's dietary habits, we're not going to get very far towards, certainly from the point of view of greenhouse gas emissions, reducing those by a sizable chunk. So one thing is about consumption. The city, the community, the family, these are some of the levels at which I think consumption, you can really start to get a handle on that. Yes, sure, you can publish national dietary guidelines, but how many people know about those, and how do they trickle down into action? The second thing is really about different levels of leadership in a national context, and I think you'll see increasing attention being paid in terms of climate change leadership to the city level, with networks like the C40 cities, where in fact cities taking a leading role on certain issues filters both down into their communities and citizens, but also up to national level and also up into an international sphere as well. So there's that dynamic of multiple levels interacting, and cities actually being important within that. And I would also say other kinds of urban areas, towns. So we don't have to be just talking about big cities here. So drawing on this, I think Thomas drew attention a lot to the red box, the inform, and that's really what our food printing work with Keel has been about. It's being able to come down to a level of a city and say, okay, well, actually we do have data that's applicable. We can get a pretty good handle without too much effort on what's going on at the city level. What are the impacts of consumption? Also play around with scenarios. What would happen if we shifted 20% of the diet to a vegetarian consumption pattern? And it's also about relevant information, and Tom's talking about the sweet spot analysis and looking at why would certain actors want to do particular things. But I really want to talk a little bit about actually how does that kind of information translate into real initiatives in cities, and in particular in cities the size of Oxford, which poses particular problems and or challenges. Tom and I have a bit of an ongoing discussion, which we might be able to pick up in the questions and discussion afterwards, around to what extent at city level do you really need a coordinating force, this food policy council kind of idea we were talking about earlier, or to what extent can you set it up so that in fact private sector actors are operating within a framework that pushes towards good sustainability outcomes, a sort of win-win situation where their profitability translates into sustainability, or to what extent you need a sort of a policy, more of a civil society policy approach to it as well.
So Julian would add a fourth box here, which would be organise at the bottom.
Yeah, I would add a political dimension to this.
Yeah.
Or probably around all of them.
Around all of them.
I would want to add it around all of them. So maybe it's part of that convincing work. I don't know. We haven't developed a proper framework for this, but yeah, and that underlies a lot of the work that I'm involved with in Oxford, with Good Food Oxford, is this feeling that actually there needs to be some sort of political or accountable multi-stakeholder group that thinks in a strategic way about how to organise these things at a city level and can push it forward, can be that motivational force. As a very basic sort of way of thinking about cities and food work, I tend to really split them up into two classes: big cities and little cities. Playing into a little bit how you set out the series, John, with the capital cities last week, and I'm just going to go through two quick examples of big cities before coming back to Oxford, because I think it can be a little bit instructional in terms of what can be achieved with resource. And I think that's the prime difference. Big cities can mobilise staff members, resource. Can give lots of airtime to these kinds of issues. One that you probably heard about in terms of food policy is New York. Been working on these kinds of issues for decades, mostly really motivated from a health point of view, interestingly. So that's a question we might also come into later, is how do the motivations of city actors tie in with what we're talking about here, looking into the environmental change part of things. New York City, just a few things to highlight really. So procurement, there's been a lot of work done on school food procurement in New York, the biggest school food district in the States. Spend $148 million a year, 25 million of that is spent regionally, so they've had a big policy push towards regional spending there. This is an idea I quite like in terms of talking about different levels in which the private sector can have a role. Is the Green Cart initiative, which was pushed forward by the previous mayor, Bloomberg, I believe. And again about health, looking at areas of the city where there's very poor access to fresh fruit and veg. He licensed a whole swathe of new food carts, and if you've been to New York City, you know that there are tons of you can get donuts on every corner, which are really like big, big glazed things. Access to fresh fruit and veg is less easy. So he licensed these vendors who go around to areas where there's a food poverty, and an evaluation of this program was published last year, and there are now several hundred of them. The bottom line seems to be that those vendors are being very commercially successful, and they are improving access to fresh fruit and veg. So it's I think that by shaping a new market, by issuing these permits, they've actually made a change relatively small in how the food system operates in those areas. This was an attempt at a larger piece of intervention into how the market works by giving more information to consumers. New York City mandated that all chain restaurants above a certain size, I think it was 15 restaurants, must post calorie counts next to their on their menus and on display boards. It met with quite fierce resistance from a lot of people. Did enter policy. There seems to be debate about how successful it is or how much it really impacts on people's behaviour, but nonetheless, an example of something being pushed forward by a city entering its policy, and is now, I think, anyone knows better than me, correct me, but I think it's now national policy that chain restaurants, from a few years' time, will also have to put calorie counts. This is to illustrate a little bit the limits of a city's power. Even a city like New York City, Bloomberg and de Blasio, new mayor, have both been trying really hard to crack down on sugary drinks, Coke, whatever, Fanta, big sodas which have huge amounts of sugar content, which is linked to poor health, obviously. 3 different initiatives that both of those mayors have pushed forward. One, a portion cap, so you can't sell anything above half a litre. 2, making sugary drinks ineligible for food stamps. And 3, slapping an 18% tax on sugary drinks in New York City. But all 3 of those initiatives have been defeated in court, and are seen as New York City having overstepped its legal mandate to make a difference there in terms of how much it can influence consumer choice. So I think that's quite interesting. Again, public health perspective, but there's no reason necessarily why environmental change kind of issues or climate change issues related to land, water, energy we're talking about couldn't be part of a package that used similar policy measures at city level. Second example to run through quickly from Brazil, Belo Horizonte, which again is a very famous example. They've been working there for several decades, I think about 20 years since they first started putting in place a food policy at a city level. Includes, I won't go through in detail, but things like subsidised restaurants, which are open to all but offer a nutritionally balanced meal at a set price. Another example Tom and I were talking about earlier in the context of private sector, it's a marketplace. So the city has made available prime commercial land to vendors or businesses at a very reduced rate or free. I'm not quite sure of the details. But it's a kind of deal they've struck. So they've said, okay, well, you can have this land to operate your market, but in return you must offer 20 basic fruit and veg items that are most consumed in Brazil at a rate that is agreed by the city to be affordable and to provide a decent return to the producers. All I've read on that matter seems to suggest that those markets are both very profitable for those who are running businesses there, and are very, very popular with people across the socioeconomic spectrum in the city. So I think from my perspective, that's a real creative use of policy, whereby it's probably not costing very much for the city to do that, but it can have a real big impact. Various other things they've done, linking up to the small producers around the city to feed into both of these programs, educational programs around school gardens and urban agriculture programs. So a whole range of different things feeding in together to make a program that's very multifaceted. So those are a couple of examples of what some big cities have been doing over quite an extended time period with plenty of results. Although it's worth pointing out that these programs in Belo Horizonte only represent something like 1 or 2%, or no, I can't remember what it is. It's like 1 or 2% of the municipal budget for the year, and have had a huge impact on food security, child malnutrition, these kinds of issues. So there seems to be some agreement that has been a cost-effective thing to do. These kinds of examples offer, I think, a great suggestion of the kinds of things that cities could do if only they had the resource or the time. Oxford, it's going to be hard to push these kinds of things forward. We're a city of 150,000. There is no food remit in our local councils. I think it's probably fair to say that the food printing report came out of a bit of nudging rather than necessarily being an initiative of the council's own back. Is that fair?
I think it's fair.
Fair. Okay, good. This is where I really want to link into the idea of civil society taking forward some of these roles, if we are to make anything of the city level as a space for for pushing forward some of these initiatives and making good on the promise that cities have or urban areas have to tackle these problems in very specific ways. Talk a bit about Good Food Oxford. There are, on a very practical level, what do these kinds of organisations look like? And that there is now a UK network called the Sustainable Food Cities Network that is pushing forward in UK cities, 30 UK cities, civil society-based initiatives that are also linked into local authority as well. But our way of looking at it here is that there are sort of 5 ingredients to get something going at a local level. And one being a movement for change or enough interested people across different sectors or different stakeholder groups in a city to make something happen. That includes local authority, but it includes university researchers, it includes business. How do you then take that forward? There has to be some sort of legitimate body to be able to channel that action in a strategic way. And this comes a bit back to my discussion with Tom about how much you need that unified voice for a city to create strategy, and how can you operate without that and do something useful. Third thing, some vision, a collective vision to bring those actors together. In Oxford, we created the Oxford Good Food Charter, which tries to set out a vision of what is sustainable food. So much wider than just the environmental dimensions of sustainable food. And also tries to be something that's very accessible to a lot of people. And that's important even for people who work in the environmental field, even for people who work in sustainability in local authorities. They may not be that knowledgeable about food sustainability issues. And so we've got to make this very, very accessible. And moving on from a vision, strategy, and Good Food Oxford is now just over a year old. We've gone through this vision process. We've gone through building and starting to build a network of organisations. There are over 100 organisations and businesses now in Oxford who are members of a network. The next stage, really, for taking that somewhere in Oxford is to articulate what exactly is within the scope of actors within the city to do. And I think we should start talking about particular actors, not just the city as an undifferentiated whole. The city does not have an existence necessarily outside of the constituent parts of it. And we're now about to sort of start engaging in that process over the next 6 months or so. Now that's where I really think there's potential for some more link up with the university and university research in informing how that's taken forward. And then that leading to programs of the type we're talking about with New York and Belo Horizonte as well. So I guess I'd like to that's a really quick overview of things that cities can do and some of the framework for that in Oxford, and also to say that there is a huge amount already going on in the city that the university is involved with. But I would like to leave it with questions of what more could be done in order to link up the university and the work that's going on in Oxford, in addition to providing this the red bubble that Tom was talking about, the informational content. What more research can be done here that is, in fact, looking more at the governance part of this, or the enacting of policies and programs, and the effectiveness of those, and the monitoring of those as well. Reflecting maybe also on Tom and my debate about how much that sort of body is necessary, and how much, in fact, we can work at city level through other means, more of these sort of win-win scenarios, working with larger corporate actors rather than more of the civic society grassroots side of things. So I think I would leave it there and hope we can have some discussion about some of those things and how they all link together.
Good. Well, thanks very much, guys. That's great. Let's say thank you for that.